Spreadsheet Scholar. Conditions are ripe for more big learning. We're going to cover more conditional functions related to if, specifically COUNTIF, SUMIF, and then the multiple criteria functions of COUNTIFs and SUMIFs. And by completing this learning video, you can count on more skills. So let's learn. We're going to be working with Fortune 500 data in this lesson, and we've worked with this data before. Now you can find a copy of a fresh workbook using this data in our Google Drive at bit.ly/excel-starter-files. That's all one word, all lowercase, and find the file named rev500starter, right-click on it, download. I'm going to save mine to the desktop, then open it up in Excel. Now we're going to be using the linked data in this workbook, so I'm going to click on Enable Content here on the right, and I'm going to click on the X to get rid of this disclaimer line, and then I'm just going to save this as functions related to if. Now we're not going to use the revenue change in column D, so I'm going to right-click on that column, and I'm going to select Delete. And then I'm going to duplicate this worksheet and turn the data into a table. Now this will give us a table so that we can double check the work in our functions with results that we can get by sorting and filtering a table that contains the same data. Now normally we don't need to do this, but it'll be nice to prove that everything is working fine while we're learning these new concepts. So to duplicate the workbook, we'll right-click on the Rev500 tab, then select Move or Copy. Then in the Before Sheet box, we'll select Move to End, click on the checkbox next to Create a Copy, then click OK, and we see that we have a copy of the existing worksheet just to the right of the original. So let's rename this copy that we just created. We'll double-click its name in the tab, and why don't we call this table Rev500 and press Return. Then we can click on the tab for this new worksheet. We'll click anywhere inside the data, and let's turn this into a table. So the shortcut for that on the Mac is Command-T. It's Control-T on Windows. My table has headers, so I'm just going to click OK, and we've got a table. And I'm going to change the format of this so that it's a banded green just to distinguish it from any other tables that we create in this lesson. And I'll zoom in to 200%. And then let's click back on the Rev500 tab to return to our original worksheet. I'll zoom in 200% here too. I'll adjust the column widths to give us a little bit more screen real estate. And then in G1, I'll add the label COUNTIF since that's the first function that we'll be working with over here on the right. And in cell G3 just below this, we'll write a note describing what we're doing, count the number of firms in my state, or at least we'll use my state, Massachusetts. Now we can find COUNTIF in the Formulas ribbon under More Functions and then Statistical Functions. And if you select COUNTIF here, the formula builder will show the function's two parameters, but it's not necessarily that intuitive to find COUNTIF inside of Statistical Functions. So if you know you're going to use COUNTIF, you can just type $COUNTIF into the cell, then tab to select it from Excel's function autocomplete, and then when the function appears in the formula bar, just click on the FX icon, and that'll also open COUNTIF up in the formula builder. Now COUNTIF simply counts up all the values in a range that meet a criteria, and we're going to look at the cells in the range containing states, and we'll add 1 to our count each time we encounter a state that meets our criteria of being equal to the abbreviation for Massachusetts, MA. So I'll click on the range, then I'll click on E2, and I'll select the entire range by pressing Shift Command down arrow on the Mac or Shift Control down arrow on Windows. This selects E2 through E501. And for criteria, I'll type in MA. That's the abbreviation for the state of Massachusetts. And if I press Tab here, notice what happens. Excel automatically surrounds the text MA in quotes. Now it needs to have the criteria values inside of double quotes unless we're referring to an address in our worksheet, but it does this for us automatically. So thank you, Excel. And then we'll click the Done button, and we've counted up 17 cells where the criteria equals MA. Now we can trust Excel, but let's double check our work anyway by heading over to the table Rev500 worksheet. Then we'll click on the filter triangle next to the state header, and we can filter where the cell equals Massachusetts. Remember how to do that. Let's add a totals row to the table, so we can click inside the table, head to the tables ribbon, click on total row, and we can see by default we get a count in the last column, and the number in there is 17, the same number we got from COUNTIF. Nice. Now, when working with formulas like COUNTIF, it can often be beneficial to work with tables instead of standard Excel cell ranges. Because, for example, if you add a value at the bottom of your data, if you use a standard range, it won't automatically expand to include that new value, but a range that references a table will expand. And let me show you how this works. First, so that you can see things better, I'm going to freeze panes above row 5, and then I'm going to scroll down below, and I'm going to enter a bogus company. In row 504, I'll enter the firm name as Gallagher Enterprises, and I'll set the state to MA for Massachusetts, but before I press Tab out of the cell, watch what's going to happen to our COUNTIF cell. When I press Tab to leave cell E502, nothing happens. Excel won't expand the standard cell range that I've used in this function to account for the new rows that I added at the bottom of this data. But now let's contrast this with what would happen if we were working with a table. So I'm going to delete this data that I entered in row 502. Let's scroll back up to the top. I'm going to unfreeze panes again, and I'm going to modify the text that I typed into G3 just for notes so that it now says count the number of firms in my state, but in parentheses I'll say with range to indicate that I used a standard Excel range in this function. And then I'll close the formula builder for now. And let me show you a trick that will be helpful in using this worksheet for notes for your own reference. It's actually possible to show the contents of a formula in a cell by using Excel's function FORMATTEXT. So watch this. I'm going to click in cell J4. I'm going to type =FORMULATEXT. I'm going to tab to accept this when Excel suggests formula text and formula completion. And now all I need to do is click back on I4, then press return, and this displays the formula in I4 in J4. So you see, it's just a nice way to be able to use this worksheet as notes. At a glance, we can see the formula that we have in I4 listed in J4. Now, before I create my table, I'm going to highlight G3 through I4, copy it, paste it starting in G5. So now I have something to modify. I'm going to click back in G5 and I'm going to change the text to read, count the number of firms in my state, but in parentheses with a table, not with a range. And now let's create that table. So I'm going to click somewhere inside of the data. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut. Remember, Command T on Mac, Control T on Windows, click OK. And we've now got a table. So let's go ahead and modify the formula in I6 with a table range instead of a standard Excel cell range. By the way, if you copy in J4 our formula text and you paste it into J6, you can see that the cell reference in I6 has shifted as a relative reference. It's now E4:E503. Now that doesn't matter for us since we're about to change things, but it's a nice reminder that if we copy and paste formulas like this, any standard cell addresses that are relative references are going to shift. And that's another thing that doesn't happen when we use table style references. Now if you want, you can just select this first parameter, which is our range, and we can modify it right inside the formula bar. But when we're learning, it's nice to see the individual parameters broken out in the formula builder. So I'm just going to click on the FX icon to bring up the formula builder. Then I'm going to delete the standard range. That's the E4:E503 in here. And we've worked with table ranges before, but notice the difference. To enter a table range, all we need to do is to position our cursor inside the header of the column we want. And when it's a downward pointing arrow, and make sure that it's in the header, you're not in the right location if it turns green and highlights the column letter like I'm showing here. So that's no good. You want to move it a little bit lower so it's not green, and then click inside of the header, and we see the table style reference is entered into the range parameter. And in my formula, it shows as table2 square bracket state close square bracket. Now table 2 is the default name for this table. If we renamed the table, that name would show up here. This is the second table that we created in this workbook, so Excel just calls it table 2. And Excel uses the square brackets and the column header as the name for all of the cells that are in that column. So click the done button and we get the same result 17, but we just used a table reference. Now why are tables better? Well, let's head to the bottom of the table. I'll freeze panes again so that you can see the formulas up top and the last row of our table down below. And I'll once again add the bogus firm Gallagher Enterprises of Massachusetts. Now I haven't tabbed out of the last cell yet to accept the MA that I just typed, but watch what happens to these results in our COUNTIF functions when I do. All right, they recalculated. 17 becomes 18, and they've also widened the range to include the new row that we added to the bottom of our data. In fact, it automatically starts adding yet another row. You see this little marker in the lower right-hand corner of cell E503. So I'm going to undo to go back to the last cell of E502. And actually, you don't see any change to the table range in our formula. It's almost like table ranges are named ranges, so you don't see the actual cell addresses that make up the range in the formula. But we know it's considering this data because we saw the change in count from 17 to 18, and we also see the addresses in the standard range that we used in the formula in I4, interestingly, were also expanded. So these used to be E2 through 501, and now they're E2 through 502. So Excel will even expand standard ranges if it senses that that range is part of a range that's inside of a table. So hopefully you see the magic of using Excel tables and why it's useful to use them in your formulas when you can. And if you are confused about how to read table references in formulas, hopefully this helps clear that up too. So I actually don't want row 502 in my table, so I'm going to right-click on that row and delete it. And I'll readjust my frozen pane so the frozen above E2. I'll click in E2, then click Unfreeze Panes to toggle off the old freeze location, and I'll click Freeze Panes again to toggle it back on, but freeze everything above E2. Now, if you're wondering if we can set up COUNTIF so that the user can enter a state instead of hard-coding the state name, yes, we can. So let's click in cell G7 and put in some descriptive text. We'll say, enter state to get firm count. And then in G8, we'll enter the label enter state. And in H8, I'll start out with Little Rhode Island, RI, and then I'll start by entering my COUNTIF formula in I8, so =COUNTIF, and then I'll click on FX to open up the formula builder, and then I'll click inside of the range field, and I'll once again click on the down arrow inside E1. I see the correct table range is entered in the range parameter. Just to show you what would happen if I accidentally clicked on the column header when it was highlighted in green, you see that that changes to E:E. That's not what I want, so I'm going to be sure that I click on the valid table range, and I see the table 2 range for the state column shows up. Then I'm going to click on the criteria field, and I'm going to click in H8, that's the cell where I typed in Rhode Island's RI. I'll click the Done button, and the formula is telling me I've got 5 Fortune 500 firms in Little Rhode Island. Now, what if I change RI to CA for California, and whoa, California has 52 Fortune 500 firms. Go Cali, living up to the nickname the Golden State. And now we can verify that our functions are working properly by heading over to the Table Rev 500 worksheet. We can click on the filter icon above state. We can type in CA. We can see the count column shows 52. If we change this to RI for Rhode Island, we see the table filter shows 5. So our COUNTIF function's working great. So let's head back to the Rev 500 worksheet, and I'll copy the formula text function from J6 and paste it into J8. So up until now, we've been performing COUNTIF on an exact match for text values, the state abbreviations. But what if we want to search for numeric criteria and maybe not look for something that was equal to a number, but maybe search for numbers that are less than a value or greater than a value? Well, we can absolutely do this. Let's enter a description of what we're about to do in G9. So we'll say we're going to count the number of firms with profits that meet the criteria below. Then in G10, we'll just put in the label criteria. But in H10, we'll enter our actual comparison criteria. And here, why don't we enter it as greater than 20,000? Now remember, our profits are actually in millions, so 20,000 would actually be 20 billion. And this is interesting because Excel usually doesn't like commas in numbers that we enter in formulas, but it's totally okay for us to enter commas in here as a separator inside of our number. And you can probably figure out how we're going to set up the rest of this function. So we'll head over to I10, we'll type in equal COUNTIF, and I'll select that from Excel formula completion, click on FX to pull up the formula builder, and inside the formula builder, we don't want the state range anymore, we want the profit range. So I'm going to click in the profit header, we see the new ranges in here as table 2, square bracket, profit M, close square bracket. And for our criteria, we're going to click in H10, click on the Done button, and we see there are 7 firms with profits above 20 billion. Now, what about firms that lost money or made no profits at all? So we can switch the criteria in H10 to less than or equal to 0, press return, and we have 60 firms in the Fortune 500 that didn't make any money at all last year. Yikes, that's over 10% of the Fortune 500 that were money losers, and that was the year before COVID. So once again, we've got real data reinforcing a most important managerial lesson. Big revenue doesn't necessarily mean big profits, and in fact, 60 of the big revenue firms in our list didn't have any profits at all. Now, if you want to verify our function is working properly, you can head back over to Table Rev 500, and you can head to the data ribbon and clear any existing filter criteria, click the filter icon in the profits header, set the criteria to less than or equal to 0, and as expected, we see 60 firms. Then we can change the filter criteria to profits greater than 20,000, which is really 20 billion, and filtering data gives us the same result that we had with COUNTIF, 7 firms. So we'll head back to the Rev 500 worksheet, and I'd rather not look at the money losers, so I'm going to reset my criteria in H10 to greater than 20,000, and I'll copy the formula text formula from J8 and paste it into J10 so that I can see my formulas inside of my worksheet. And entering criteria into a cell works great, but what if we wanted a hard code criteria? Well, I actually want to show you that too, because Excel's behavior for entering criteria into the formula instead of it having read from the cell is actually not very intuitive, and it can lead to some problems. So let's set up some descriptive text for what we're about to do. I'm going to copy G9 and I'm going to paste it into G11, and I'm going to change the text to read, count the number of firms with profits greater than 15,000. Which is really greater than 15 billion. Then instead of entering my COUNTIF from scratch, I'm just going to highlight both I10 and J10. I'm going to paste those into I12 and J12. Then I'm going to click in I12, and I'm going to click on the FX icon in the formula bar, and I can edit the COUNTIF formula. Now first, the easy part. I could change the criteria to read greater than or equal to 15,000. And when I tab and then press done, I can see that Excel puts the entire criteria between double quotes. Now that looks weird, but it works. It's showing me that there are 13 firms that have profits greater than 15 billion. And if I head over to Table Rev 500 to verify that, I can see, yep, there are 13 firms that have profits above 15 billion, which is 15,000 at our data. But here's where it gets even weirder. So let's head back to the Rev 500 worksheet. So I'll adjust my columns for more screen real estate, and I'll copy the text in G11 and paste it in G13 and modify it to say, count the number of firms with profits greater than value below. In G14, I'll enter some text that's just a label, profits greater than, with a colon to remind the user to enter something next to this. Then I'll copy I12 and J12, paste that into I14, and then in I14, I'll open the COUNTIF function so that it's in the formula builder. Here's where the criteria is a little tricky. You might think, well, Let's set the criteria to greater than in double quotes. Now I suppose I'm breaking with what I entered earlier. I had previously said greater than or equal to, but it doesn't really matter with our data since we don't have a value that's equal to exactly 15 billion, but do know that greater than or equal to will consider values that are equal to 15 billion in addition to greater than, whereas just greater than will ignore any values that are equal to 15 billion. And then after the double quotes, click on the cell H14 where we're going to enter our criteria. Now Excel will put a plus sign between the end double quote and H14, and that's actually not what we want. So let's see the problem. We'll click done and we'll put 15,000 in cell H14. And this shows me 0, but it should be showing me 13, which is the value we got from a similar calculation in I-12. So what's going on here? Well, this is very strange, but Excel needs to build criteria as a string of text. And if you look back, you'll see that all of the values that were not cell addresses that we put in as our criteria parameters have been in double quotes, and that means string. So to take the value in H14 and add it to the criteria after the string, that's the greater than symbol in double quotes, we need to replace plus with an ampersand. Remember that guy from our other videos? That's what we use to add string values or text values together. Now I'm going to go ahead and enter this right in the formula bar. I could go back into the formula builder, but I'll do it right here. Now we didn't notice this before because if we just have a cell reference inside of one of our criteria parameters, Excel will convert what's ever in that cell into a string behind the scenes. But if we build out a formula like this, we need to use an ampersand and not a plus. So we'll see that when we press return, the COUNTIF calculates the number of firms with profits greater than 15,000 or 15 billion as 13, the same value we got above. Nice! So remember, building formulas with criteria, you may need ampersands to combine strings and cell references. Well, counts are cool, but what if we wanted to find total revenue? Now that involves summing up revenues based on a criteria, not just counting them up. And we can do this with a function named SUMIF. So let's go down to cell G17, and I'm going to put in some text in our worksheet just to signify that we're working with SUMIF down here so that we can use this worksheet as a notes reference. And then below that, I'll say total revenue for state entered below. And in G19, I'll enter the label state. And in H19, we'll start out with the state Massachusetts, that's MA. And then let's write our formula in I-19. Now, unfortunately, if you explore the formulas ribbon, you'll find that the COUNTIF and SUMIF formulas aren't grouped together. I would have put them both under the logical dropdown since they both have if in them, but SUMIF isn't even next to COUNTIF, which is in the statistical dropdown. SUMIF is actually in a grouping called math and trig, so it's probably easier for you just to type in equals SUMIF and then click on FX and open it in the formula builder. Now, SUMIF works just like COUNTIF, but we have one more parameter. We'll search a range for a criteria. We've seen that before, but we'll also specify a third parameter, SUMRANGE, which is the range of numbers that we're going to sum up if our range and criteria match. So your SUMRANGE column will often be entirely different from your range and criteria column. So in our case, we'll say search for the range for state, so I'll click in the table header for state and the table range goes in there, for the state value where the criteria is equal to H15, and for all the values where the range contains what we entered in H15, we'll sum up the values that we highlight in the SUMRANGE, which will be our revenues column. Then click done, and will you look at that? The number in here is over 450,000, which is really over 450 billion. I'll put a formula text in J19 so that we can see our formula in here, and we'll head back to the home ribbon and format I-19 with a $sign, and if we double check this value with our table Rev 500 worksheet, we can sum up our revenue column and our total row. We'll head up to the data ribbon and we'll clear the existing filter, then we'll filter on state equals MA for Massachusetts, and we see that we get the exact same value in our total row that we got with SUMIF. SUMIF is working perfectly. So let's head back to the Rev 500 worksheet. You can experiment with different values. California is huge. Rhode Island has a nice showing. Montana has 0 in there because it has no Fortune 500 firms. We'll head back to Rhode Island. So up until now, we've searched to count or sum values on a single criteria, but sometimes you want to search on multiple criteria. Well, we can do that with COUNTIFs and SUMIFs. That's COUNTIF and SUMIF, but with an S at the end. The S stands for plural, as in there are multiple ifs that we're using as criteria. So let's start out with COUNTIFs and see how this works. I'll put some text in G21 that says COUNTIFs to make it clear that we're working with this. I'll bold that cell, then down in G22, I'll describe the criteria as count of California firms with greater than 30 billion in profits. So we'll have two criteria in here, firms that are in the state of California and that have profits greater than 30 billion, which is listed as 30,000 in our data. And then in I-23, I'll type in equals COUNTIFs make sure that you add the S at the end, select that from formula completion, and we'll click the FX icon in the formula bar to bring up the formula builder. And for COUNTIFs with the S at the end, the formula builder looks a bit different, but it's not too difficult to understand. We have a plus icon down here, which allows us to add more parameters to our function. So let's set up our first criteria range as the table's state column. Then I'll click on the plus button and look what happens in the formula builder. We see Excel adds another parameter named criteria1, and we can continue to click on plus to add more criteria ranges and criteria. There is an upper limit on the number of criteria you can add, but it's way larger than you would practically use. It's above 24. So then we can set criteria 1 as CA, that's the abbreviation for California, and when I tab, Excel will add double quotes around CA, thank you Excel, and if I click plus again, I can see a second criteria. This time we'll select the table range for profits, we'll click plus again, and we'll set a second criteria. This time it'll be greater than 30,000, which is really 30 billion, and we'll click the done button, and we see that California has 2 firms with greater than 30 billion in profits. Now I'll copy one of my formula text cells and paste it into J23 so that you can see the formula we just entered, and if you want to double check your work in the table Rev 500 worksheet, we can just click on the data tab, press clear, we can enter a filter for the state equal to CA for California, we can enter another filter on profits that are greater than 30,000, and we see that California indeed has 2 firms with profits greater than 30 billion, Apple and Alphabet. Once again, tech rakes in the coin. So let's head back to the Rev 500 worksheet, and you might wonder, hey, do I even need COUNTIF? Can I just use COUNTIFs with the S at the end and just enter a single criteria range and criteria? And the answer is yes, that would work fine. So I'll show you. In I-23, I'm going to highlight the second criteria range and criteria. Now, if I delete this COUNTIFs function will only count up one criteria and range. It'll count firms that are in the criteria range state and look for a criteria where that's equal to CA for California. And if I scroll up here, I did the same with a single COUNTIF in cell I8, and that returned a value of 52. So I'm going to delete this second set of criteria range and criteria in my COUNTIFs formula, and I'm going to press return to accept these changes. And I see I also get a 52. Same thing, COUNTIFs with an S with only one criteria range and criteria is the same as a COUNTIF. But I'll undo this with a Command Z on the Mac, Control Z on Windows to return to my multiple criteria COUNTIFs. And now let's try out SUMIFS. That's a SUMIF that also has multiple criteria. So we'll do that below. We'll set up a SUMIFS to sum up on 2 criteria, a state and a profit value. So in G25, I'll put in some notes text. We'll start off with SUMIFS. I'll bold that, Command B on Mac, Control B on Windows. Then below that, I'll describe this as sum of revenues for firms that meet the state and profit criteria below. And in G27, I'll label the first criteria as state. In H27, I'll label the second criteria as profit. And then in G28, I'll enter my first state criteria as MA. And then in H28, I'll enter an initial profit criteria of less than 0. So we'll be looking for money losers in Massachusetts. And now let's enter our SUMIFS function with multiple criteria. So in I-28, we'll type in equals SUMIFS with an S. We'll accept the formula completion with a tab. We'll click on the FX icon in the formula bar, and the formula builder pops up for SUMIFS. Now the format for this function is nearly identical to COUNTIFs, except we start with a sum range, which is the range of values that we're going to sum up for the cells that meet our multiple criteria. So for us, we want to sum up the firm's revenue. So we'll click on the table's revenues column, then we can click on the plus button and add criteria ranges and criteria. So our first criteria range will be the table's state column. Then we'll click plus again, and now we can set our first criteria, and we'll do that by clicking on cell G28. That's where we typed in MA. Then we'll click plus again. We'll set up a second criteria range. This will be the table's profits column. Now notice that this criteria is the profit column, which is different from our sum column. We're going to be summing up the revenue, not the profit, but we're going to be searching through and filtering on profit. Then click the plus button again so we can add our second criteria, and that will be cell H28, which is where we've initially entered less than 0. Now press done. And this works. Excel shows the money losers in Massachusetts have a market cap of about 104 billion. That's 104,000 as we see it represented in I-28. But remember, this figure is in millions, so 104,000 million is 104 billion. And if you want, you should know how to verify this in the Table 500 worksheet. I won't take you through the steps here because you should know them by now, but I'm going to do them here, and we can see that we get the same result that we had with our SUMIFS. Nice! Now just a quick strategic side note for those of you reading the IS book, Wayfair lost money this year. Now Wayfair is the largest home goods e-commerce retailer, and they're still in their high growth phase. So this firm is plowing its cash back into growing operations and gaining scale, and that's very similar to what Amazon had been doing for years, fueling its own growth at the expense of harvesting short-term profits. That's a nice strategic side note, but why don't we head back to our Rev 500 worksheet? We'll format I-28 in dollars and cents. We'll add the formula text to J28 to show our formulas in I28. And once again, you're counting up some new Excel skills. That's all we have for this video. In the next video, we'll cover one more function related to if. That will be the if error function that allows us to specify what we should show if we get an error back from Excel, but we'll do that with some new content. But in terms of what we covered in this video lesson, well, we covered quite a bit. We worked with COUNTIF and SUMIF, COUNTIFs and SUMIFS for multiple criteria. We took a look at the strangeness in building Excel criteria values, and we learned to use the ampersand for building formula criteria. We also learned how to use the formula text to show formulas that are inside of cells, and we showed some important behavioral differences between table references and standard Excel addresses. And we got some additional practice with table filtering. Nice work, Spreadsheet Scholar. Stay excellent.